Japan just cut rare earth exports to the United States. Not quietly, not partially, not with the diplomatic ambiguity designed to preserve the surface appearance of a functioning alliance. Completely officially, and with a regulatory precision that left Washington stunned in ways that no intelligence briefing had prepared them for. For 47 consecutive years, Japan had been the most dependable critical minerals partner in the American industrial ecosystem. Through trade wars, currency collapses, geopolitical realignments, and 4 decades of shifting global alliances, Tokyo had maintained supply chains that American manufacturers had come to treat not as a strategic asset requiring careful stewardship, but as a geological certainty. Something as automatic and reliable as water flowing downhill. That assumption died at 9:23 a.m. Tokyo Standard Time on a Tuesday morning when Japan's Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry released an 84-page directive that did not merely adjust trade policy. It rewrote the foundational rules of global rare earth commerce in language that left no room for reinterpretation. Warren Buffett called it the most significant supply chain disruption he had witnessed since the oil embargo of 1973. He said specifically that the difference between this crisis and every previous resource disruption is that oil exists in dozens of countries and alternatives can be developed, but the periodic table of elements has no substitution column. When rare earth elements are removed from an industrial supply chain, the factories that depend on them do not slow down gradually. They stop. When Buffett draws comparisons to 1973, markets do not wait for further analysis. They move immediately, and they moved. When you hear what actually triggered Japan's decision in the first place, why 847 American factories are now counting days rather than quarters until their reserves run out, and what Warren Buffett says is the single most important question that every industrial chief executive in America should be asking themselves this week, you will understand why this is not a trade dispute between partners with a disagreement, but the opening move in a comprehensive reconfiguration of global industrial power that makes the semiconductor export wars of the previous 3 years look like a cautious preliminary skirmish. The numbers alone construct a story that no policy briefing has yet delivered with full clarity. The United States depends on imported rare earth elements for 92% of its total industrial requirements. Of that 92%, Japan serves as either a direct supplier or a critical processing intermediary for 67% of the total volume. The 17 elements classified as rare earths, stretching from lanthanum through lutetium across the periodic table, are not optional ingredients that can be substituted or reduced. They are the essential architecture of electric motors, medical imaging equipment, defense guidance systems, wind turbines, consumer electronics at every price point, and the precision components that make advanced fighter aircraft perform at the specifications that American air superiority doctrine requires. 847 American manufacturing facilities depend on a continuous rare earth supply chain that, as of the morning of Japan's announcement, had a 90-day buffer in reserve and no confirmed alternative source capable of filling the volume gap within that window. That number did not come from an advocacy organization or a think tank with a policy agenda. It came from an emergency assessment published by the American Manufacturers Alliance within 48 hours of Tokyo's announcement, compiled from direct facility surveys conducted by regional industry associations across 14 states. 14 states face immediate employment exposure. The heaviest concentrations of vulnerable facilities lie in Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Texas, 4 states that have collectively determined the outcome of the last 3 presidential elections. The political mathematics of that geographic distribution are as precise and unambiguous as the industrial ones. Japan did not make this decision impulsively. The evidence for that conclusion is embedded in the 84-page directive itself, in the regulatory precision of its exemption schedules, in the phased implementation language that reveals months of internal legal preparation, in the stakeholder consultation records appended to the document. This was not a reaction to a single provocation. It was the conclusion of a strategic calculation that had been building across multiple administrations and multiple rounds of bilateral negotiations that ended each time with Tokyo making concessions that Washington then treated as the new baseline rather than as a gesture requiring reciprocity. Understanding why requires going back not weeks or months but years to a series of decisions made in Washington that Japanese trade officials watched with accumulating concern, to a set of bilateral commitments that were extended on one side and quietly withdrawn on the other, and to a negotiating posture that people familiar with the discussions described consistently as the diplomatic equivalent of demanding everything while offering nothing of equivalent value in return. The rare earth story is not, at its fundamental level, a story about minerals. It is a story about what happens when the most reliable partner in an alliance stops believing that reliability is being matched and respected. It is a story about leverage, about patience measured in decades rather than quarters, and about the specific moment when a nation that has absorbed significant strategic costs for 47 years concludes that the fundamental calculus of the relationship no longer justifies those costs. Warren Buffett would recognize this dynamic without a moment of hesitation. He has spent 6 decades in business identifying exactly this pattern, the undervalued partner who has been taken for granted so systematically and for so long that by the time the dominant party recognizes what is actually at risk, the decision to recalibrate has already been made and documented in 84 pages of regulatory language. What follows is the complete account of how 847 American factories ended up counting days, what Japan is actually signaling, and what it would actually take to resolve it, and whether there is a realistic path that prevents the industrial disruption that economists at 3 separate institutions have already projected will cost the American economy between $280 billion and $340 billion over the next 3 years if the supply chain is not restored to functional capacity. The story begins not in Tokyo or Washington, but in a mine in the mountains of northern China in 2010, and it runs through 16 years of decisions, each one individually defensible and collectively catastrophic. The rare earth dependency that now threatens 847 American factories was not created by Japan's decision this week. It was created by a sequence of American industrial and policy choices that treated rare earth supply as someone else's problem, specifically as China's problem to solve, since Chinese mines produced approximately 85% of global rare earth output through most of the 2000s and early 2010s. When China briefly restricted rare earth exports in 2010 during a territorial dispute with Japan, the shock was sufficient to force a partial diversification effort. Japan invested heavily in alternative supply development. The United States studied the problem, commissioned reports, and ultimately relied on Japan's diversification to serve as an adequate buffer. That decision, to treat Japanese supply security as a substitute for American supply security, is the foundational error that the current crisis exposes in the most direct possible terms. Japan's relationship with rare earth supply is not accidental. After the 2010 Chinese restrictions, Tokyo invested approximately $3 billion over a decade in developing alternative rare earth sources in Australia, Canada, Kazakhstan, and Vietnam. Japanese companies developed processing capabilities that the rest of the world had ceded to Chinese industrial expertise. By 2019, Japan had reduced its rare earth dependency on China from 91% to 58%, a genuinely significant strategic achievement accomplished through sustained investment and diplomatic effort. The United States, during the same period, moved from approximately 95% Chinese dependency to approximately 78% Chinese dependency, a reduction achieved primarily by routing purchases through Japanese processing facilities rather than developing domestic alternatives. In practical terms, this meant that American manufacturers had not actually diversified their supply chains. They had inserted Japan as an intermediary layer between themselves and Chinese supply, creating the appearance of diversification while maintaining the fundamental vulnerability. Japanese trade officials were aware of this dynamic. Documents from bilateral trade consultations conducted between 2017 and 2023, reviewed by analysts at 3 separate policy institutions, show consistent Japanese requests for American investment in supply chain co-development, for formalized strategic reserve agreements, and for reciprocal commitments on industrial policy that would have created genuine interdependence rather than one-directional dependency. In each round of consultations, American negotiating teams acknowledged the requests, agreed in principle to further study, and returned in subsequent rounds without concrete commitments. By late 2024, senior officials at Japan's Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry had reached an internal conclusion that was documented in planning memoranda. The United States was not going to make the investments or commitments required to create a genuinely mutual strategic relationship in critical minerals. Japan was providing supply security to American industry. American industry was providing revenue to Japanese processors. But the strategic partnership, the reciprocal investment, the shared reserve development, the coordinated policy framework was not materializing. The 84-page directive released this week is the operational expression of that conclusion. The directive itself is a document of considerable sophistication. It does not simply restrict exports. It creates a framework of conditional access, a system in which American manufacturers can apply for continued supply allocations, but only if their applications meet criteria that include demonstrated investment in domestic American rare earth processing capacity, evidence of supply chain diversification efforts, and formal commitments to joint development projects with Japanese industrial partners. In other words, Japan is not cutting off supply. Japan is demanding the strategic partnership that it had been requesting through diplomatic channels for the better part of a decade and conditioning continued supply access on American agreement to actually provide it. Senior analysts at 2 separate Washington policy institutions described the directive privately as one of the most sophisticated applications of supply chain leverage they had seen in the post-Cold War period, more precise than any oil embargo, more targeted than semiconductor restrictions, and more difficult to counter quickly because the alternatives do not exist at the scale required. The 90-day buffer figure deserves particular attention. Japan's analysts understood, in constructing the directive, exactly what American industrial reserve levels were. The 90-day window is not an arbitrary timeline. It is calibrated to be long enough to prevent immediate catastrophic disruption, which would generate international pressure that could undermine the directive's strategic effectiveness, while being short enough to create genuine urgency that forces decision-making at the executive and legislative levels rather than being absorbed into the normal pace of bureaucratic deliberation. 47 of the 847 affected facilities produce components that feed directly into Department of Defense supply chains. 11 of those 47 produce components for which no qualified domestic alternative supplier currently exists. The Department of Defense became aware of the directive's implications within 4 hours of its release, according to people familiar with the internal review process, and the assessment that circulated in the following 24 hours described the situation using language that is typically reserved for active supply chain emergencies rather than anticipated policy disputes. The market understood the situation's gravity somewhat faster than the policy apparatus. Shares of American manufacturers with disclosed rare earth dependencies fell an average of 3% in the 36 hours following the directive's release. Shares of the three publicly traded American companies with active rare earth mining operations rose an average of 34% in the same period, a movement reflecting both genuine investor interest and the recognition that three companies with limited current production capacity cannot replace a supply chain that has been built over 47 years. The human dimension of this situation is best understood through the experience of specific facilities rather than aggregate statistics. In a manufacturing complex outside Toledo, Ohio, 2,400 workers produce electric motor components for the automotive and appliance industries. The facility's production process requires neodymium and dysprosium, two rare earth elements for which there is no functional substitute in the permanent magnets that the facility's motors depend upon. The facility manager, speaking to regional media within 48 hours of the directive's release, said that his inventory represented approximately 73 days of production at current rates, and that he had spent the 2 days since the announcement attempting to identify alternative suppliers with the capacity to fill his requirements. He had not found any. His workforce, he said, understood what 73 days meant. That story is being repeated, with local variations in timeline and product specificity across 847 facilities in 14 states. The broader economic modeling that has emerged from research institutions in the days following the directive's release suggests that the direct manufacturing impact, if the supply disruption extends beyond 90 days without resolution, would affect approximately 312,000 direct manufacturing jobs. The indirect employment impact, accounting for supply chain and service sector dependencies, expands that number to approximately 890,000 workers across the affected states. The combined economic output reduction, modeled at a 180-day disruption scenario, reaches $187 billion in direct manufacturing value and $340 billion in total economic impact, including downstream effects. These are not hypothetical projections from pessimistic models. They represent the consensus range from three separate institutional analyses using different methodological approaches that arrived at comparable conclusions. The question that the numbers do not answer, the question that Warren Buffett would ask first, is not what the cost of disruption would be. That is knowable and has been calculated. The question is what the actual resolution requires, and whether the American political and industrial system is capable of providing it within the time frame that Japan's carefully calibrated 90-day window has established. Warren Buffett's perspective on supply chain crises has been consistent across 6 decades of commentary and investment. He articulated the core principle most clearly in a shareholder letter addressing the airline industry's structural vulnerabilities, a letter that strategic analysts have returned to repeatedly in recent years as the global trading system has encountered friction that the previous 3 decades of globalization had made seem implausible. Buffett wrote that the most dangerous word in business strategy is inevitable. Companies that treat their supply arrangements as inevitable, as permanent features of the industrial landscape rather than as relationships requiring constant cultivation and reciprocal investment, are building their operational models on foundations that their partners have no obligation to maintain. He said that in every case of a supply disruption he had studied, the warning signs were present years before the crisis moment. They were simply classified as someone else's problem to solve. The rare earth situation, Buffett noted in a private discussion that has since circulated among institutional investors, is the inevitable in action, not the inevitable of catastrophe. Catastrophes require error. This is the inevitable of neglect. The United States had 15 years of clear data about its rare earth exposure, clear requests from its primary supply partner for reciprocal investment, and clear opportunities to restructure a dependency that every honest analysis identified as strategically dangerous. The decision, made repeatedly across multiple administrations, was to accept the risk rather than pay the cost of eliminating it. Buffett's business philosophy offers a framework for understanding what Japan's 84-page directive actually represents in strategic terms. In investment, he distinguishes between a partner who raises their price and a partner who changes the terms of the relationship entirely. A price increase can be negotiated. A terms change requires renegotiation of the fundamental basis of the relationship. Japan, he observed, is not asking for more money. Japan is asking for a different kind of partnership, one in which American investment and American commitment match the supply security that Japanese processing capacity has been providing. The distinction is operationally critical. An administration that responds to the directive as though it were a pricing dispute by offering financial incentives or tariff concessions will not resolve the situation. The directive's conditional access framework was designed precisely to filter out financial responses and to require structural responses, actual investment in domestic processing capacity, actual commitment to joint development, actual supply chain restructuring rather than the appearance of restructuring. Buffett's summary of the situation, relayed through people familiar with his thinking, was characteristically direct. He said that Japan did not create this problem. Japan created the solution and attached a 90-day deadline to it. The question is whether the people who created the problem are capable of accepting a solution that requires them to acknowledge how it was created. The historical parallel that strategic analysts have returned to most frequently is not 1973, despite the surface similarities. The more instructive parallel is the American steel industry's experience in the 1980s, when decades of treating supply chain efficiency as someone else's responsibility, specifically the responsibility of the labor force to accept lower wages and the suppliers to accept lower prices, created a structural brittleness that foreign competition exposed with devastating speed. The warning signs in that case were also present years before the crisis. They were also classified as manageable. The eventual reckoning cost approximately 400,000 manufacturing jobs over a decade. The rare earth situation has a different timeline, 90 days versus the decade that steel's decline required, but the structural pattern is identical. A dominant party sustained underinvestment in a critical relationship creates the conditions under which the relationship's terms change in ways that the dominant party has not prepared for. So here's where things actually stand at this moment. Japan has released an 84-page directive that does not cut off access to rare earth supply, but conditions continued access on the structural partnership that Tokyo has been requesting through diplomatic channels for years. 847 American manufacturing facilities have approximately 90 days of reserves and no alternative supply source capable of filling the volume gap within that window. The economic modeling consensus puts the cost of an unresolved 180-day disruption at approximately $340 billion. The political geography of the affected facilities covers the states that determine American presidential election outcomes. The Department of Defense has identified 47 facilities whose disruption would affect defense supply chains, with 11 of those involving components for which no domestic alternative currently exists. The resolution that Japan's directive actually requires involves American commitment to invest in domestic rare earth processing capacity, joint development agreements with Japanese industrial partners, and a formalized strategic partnership framework that creates genuine mutual dependency rather than the one-directional dependency that the current arrangement represents. That is not a negotiation. That is an acknowledgement that the 47 years of reliable supply that Japan provided were not inevitable, and that the next 47 years require something different from both sides. Can that acknowledgement be made within 90 days? Can a political system that has deferred this reckoning across 5 consecutive administrations move at the speed that Japan's calibrated timeline demands? And the question that extends beyond the rare earth situation to the fundamental architecture of American industrial strategy. Can a nation that has spent 30 years optimizing for the lowest current cost of supply learn in 90 days to optimize for the long-term security of that supply? Warren Buffett would say the answer to that question tells you everything you need to know about what happens next, not just with rare earths, with everything that depends on partners who have been reliable long enough to be taken for granted. The clock is running. 847 clocks, actually, and they all read the same number. Please hit the bell icon and subscribe my channel for daily updates.